Hello. Hi, everyone. We are back with the very special guest today. I'm just trying not to fangirl right now. I'll just be quiet. Andres,
Welcome.
Elisa.
Thanks very much for the invitation, by the way, Elena and Elisa. I've listened to the show or watched the show. We've established that it's not a podcast.
It's not a
It's not
podcast.
a
Yeah,
podcast.
it's not a podcast. So, but I'm delighted because I've listened a few times and I was very interested. And when you gave me an invitation, I could not refuse, of course. But thanks very much for the invitation again.
Thank you so much,
Delighted.
Andres. Yeah, we have this is our lucky episode 13. 13 is definitely my lucky number. I was born on 13. But today we have a fascinating topic, which is very close to my heart. And I think there's a lot of talk in the industry about open versus closed or proprietary AI models and how that will play out in terms of kind of a legal framework and just in the society as a whole. And I would like to introduce Andres, Andres Guadamuz. He's joining us from the UK, actually, so it's pretty late, but thank you, Andres. And Andres' expertise lies in open source software, not surprising why we have Andres today, information technology law, software patents, social media, intellectual property, cryptocurrencies, and blockchain. And Andres is actually a professor in intellectual property law in the University of Sussex, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of World Intellectual Property. And Andres's research, main research areas are on artificial intelligence, copyright, open licensing, smart contracts. And Andres is also an author because he has written 2 books and over 40 articles and book chapters. And Andres also has a really cool a blog that's called Technolama about AI-related copyright issues in the creative sector. So welcome, Professor Guadamuz. And from there, I guess we will pass on baton to you to talk about a really interesting topic today. And take it away.
Thanks very much. And once again, thanks for the invitation. I'm really, really, really delighted to be here. I'm not just saying that. Um, and this is a very interesting subject. So, one of the things that perhaps I always like to start representations either with an apology or a story. And um, it's the story here is that I actually started looking at open source way too long time ago. I'm not going to specify exactly when, but when I was looking at open source software, I think I I had a bit of a technical problem. Something jumped in my screen, so
We
apologies for
can
that.
see it.
Yeah,
So it's
okay, that's good. Um, so one of the interesting things that was happening was that there was a very big dichotomy between open and closed models in software development. So there was pretty much either the open source camp and the proprietary camp. But eventually, as everyone knows, open source won because if it was a war, you could argue that we won the war. The old enemies like Microsoft became open source advocates at some point. So very interesting things happened in that space, in which open source development, open source software started sort of becoming more mainstream. And it was becoming mainstream precisely because people were um, finding it useful, cheaper to use, and it had all of the advantages that open source software has. That I'm not going to go into this now. What I've been finding quite interesting and fascinating in recent years is precisely that we're starting to see sort of the similar debates that we saw with open source software in AI models, particularly with the AI development. So we are seeing a little bit of this discussion. If you spend any time or in AI Twitter, I'm never going to call it X, by the way, AI Twitter.
No.
You'll find that there is always a bit of a discussion or a bit of a fight on that, and we start seeing a, perhaps not the same debates, but a little bit of the same similar camps developing. So we've had people who are very strongly advocating open source artificial intelligence. This is Emad Mostak, who used to be the CEO of Stability AI, one of the companies that have been at the forefront of proposing open models. And I think that of all of the large companies that are doing this, there are a few that are sort of uh, the open source advocates. And as you can see here is that of open source AI. So I always find this a little bit quite fascinating. Then we start seeing Microsoft advertising themselves as open source AI and commitments to building AI cloud. We can see this announcement where they say Microsoft loves open source and by the way, younger me would have been absolutely, my mind would have been blown just by seeing this. Um, that
That's
we would
cute.
see this. Absolutely. You can start seeing, it, it wasn't a long time ago where we had open source advocates sort of demonizing Bill Gates at the time, who was I don't know. I don't know if we're backliking him or not, but that's another question. So it's interesting that everyone is doing it, and most recently, um, we've had this mind-blowing announcement by Mark Zuckerberg, and it has. Uh, uh, there have been quite a lot of memes about this, and
Yeah.
people were commenting the chain, and
Oh,
there's
really?
yeah, that his hair has grown. He looks a little bit more human.
Hmm.
There's always been the joke that he's a bit robotic, but and there are
Generative
memes, by
AI
the way.
help.
Yeah, and there are. By the way, there are memes with people used Photoshop or AI or something to give him
Yeah.
a beard. People are saying, "Oh, actually, he looks kind of cute." So that is, but that is another question. His announcement of Llama 3, of their latest model, other than making lots of waves because of the size of the model, but also the benchmarks appear to be. I haven't used it myself, so uh, even though it's called Llama,
Yes, you would be the first person to grab it and
yeah,
test it.
yeah. Some people have wondered
Mm.
if Technolama actually comes from
Yeah.
from large language models. No, I was into llamas before they were cool. So uh, as you can say, but one of the interesting things has been precisely that this large company, this one of the big giants in technology, is so openly saying, and in his presentation, I'm not going to play. I always find that playing video is a bit clunky, but he says specifically that they are going to be open source. Now,
Mm.
that is a debate of whether or not it is, uh, but it, I find it fascinating that all of these companies are precisely doing this, are um, promoting but also advertising themselves as being open source. So, but are they? Because uh, sometimes you see that whenever I see open source used in this context, the first thing that comes into my mind is you keep using that word. I don't not think that it means what you think it means. So sometimes openness, people depend on or depends on what we understand or how do we define open source. So we need to explore if what is going on is actually open source software. So uh,
Yeah.
or an open source models. So what uh, the difficulty that we are having is precisely with definitions, and I think there are usually two ways of thinking about this. I feel, particularly there are two meanings. So uh, lots of people use the term open source to define uh, uh, anything that is released to the public. So no matter which license. So as long as something is released in something like, for example, Hugging Face or one of the public repositories, regardless of the license, it's going to be considered open source. So that is sort of the one definitions, one of the definitions that we're seeing. And it's actually quite popular because um, just thinking about whenever I've been presenting about this subject, people still tend not to understand open source software, open source licensing. There is a lot of misunderstanding. Alisa, I think that you probably can empathize with that.
Yeah. I mean, I've just revamped our open source and IP training for our engineering, and just basically, one slide that says what makes software open source, and have people think it's available in the internet. It's freely downloadable. It's something like Stack Overflow. No, it's the license. But yeah, I'll let you I'll let you delve into that. Yeah.
No, but that's perfect because I know you've had some experience in this. So it is really fascinating that a lot of people understand that this is precisely what open source models or open source AI is. It's more about just being public on the internet,
Publicly available. Yeah.
Yeah, or GitHub or Hugging Face or another repository. The other definition that the people that have been making that criticism is that AI tools, models, and outdoor data sets, and this is the problem that we have, that there are lots of moving parts when it comes to artificial intelligence. So it's not only the tools themselves that we use, like ChatGPT or all the other ones, but we also have the models themselves, which could be tricky. I'm going to mention this a bit later, and then the data sets themselves, whether or not they are released with open source or open licenses in general. So that also, of course, I'm not going to go into detail on this. But there are different definitions. So we have the free software definition of what is free software, that it has to comply with the four I call them the four laws of freedom that from the Free Software Foundation, and there is a much more detailed definition, which is the open source initiative definition. So and they have a list of licenses, and if it's in that list of licenses, then it's considered to be open source. So I know that the audience probably knows this already, but it just for completeness to keep that in mind. So we may have to have also a debate or of which licenses are acceptable, which licenses are not. There are lots of complexities there. So in opposition to this, we have the closed or proprietary artificial intelligence. So this can also have several meanings. So we have, for example, the closed data sets. This is usually now a standard for most large projects. So there are some data sets that are available to everyone that are online. The Common Crawl is a good example of a large data set that is available to. It's public and it's available to everyone who can use it or wants to use it, and it consists mostly of information that has been, or text that has been scraped from the web. So that is one of the databases that is open. Lion is another one, LAION, which is a German-based data set. This is released under a Creative Commons license, and it consists of links to images. It doesn't. It's a big misrepresentation that it actually contains images. It does not. But for the most part, these are data sets that are public. So the opposite is all of the data sets that are being used by by trainers. And as I mentioned, for the most part, we don't know. Uh, we don't have access uh, to them because what has been happening is that if you are very transparent, and we will go into transparency a bit later, if you're very transparent, you may end up getting sued. So there is a very good reason why people are not being proactive in sharing their data sets. The other thing is closed models accessible only through the API. So you train the model itself, and you don't make the model available. So some models are available, some open models that are available. So uh, Stable Diffusion has some models that you can download yourself. And for example, if you want to operate with ChatGPT, you have to operate through an API. And most of those other models are closed, and you can interact with them either through an outward facing tool, a web facing tool, or an API. And then there are models released to the public, but with reuse restrictions. So they are they would not be released under an open source model, but you can use them. So usually they're going to have some form of restriction. So those are sort of the environment that we have at the moment with open source and with closed proprietary models. So um, there are a few definitions that we have. I like definitions, so I've obviously academics, we always like definitions. This is sort of my definition that I've been toying around. So it usually refers to artificial intelligence software and tools that are developed and distributed under an open source license. So this is, to me, it's very important that we should make that distinction from the start. It's not that the model is released to the public; it has to be released under a Creative Commons license, not under an open source license. I'm thinking about data sets could be released under Creative Commons. So these licenses allow, obviously, users to freely access, modify, and distribute the software. The key characteristics of these open source models include accessibility. So the source code is available to the public. In the case of a model, the model itself would have to be available to the public, and allowing everyone to examine, modify, improve. And this encourages collaboration and innovation. This is one of the basic principles of open source. It has to be available to the public, and the public has to be able to tinker with it. Then there is also an encouragement. This allows the community to develop. It also allows transparency. You can see what you're working with, and also one of the advantages is the cost effectiveness. So it makes things more cost effective. So obviously, this definition this definition includes licenses, so we have to examine which licenses we're going to be talking about. So we have roughly speaking, three types of licenses depending on what we're talking about. So the software itself, the tools themselves that you're using, so it can be either the software that eventually you operate with or you interact with through an API, or maybe there's some software that you're going to get as part of the AI that can be released using traditional software licenses, MIT, GPL, Apache, LGPL, MPL, Mozilla public license, etc. Now, I don't. By the way, we should probably include at some point a link. I don't know if you heard that someone made the MIT license into a song using.
Yeah, that was on LinkedIn.
I loved it.
Those are basically synthesized voice singing the MIT license grant. I listened to it, and I think that our opinions differed. Elena liked it. She said it was sad and beautiful.
I liked it.
give me a break. Why would we even need this? But it was,
Yeah,
it
come
was,
on.
it was just kind of a funny piece
Yeah,
of, and then the conversation turned into, music and, AI writing music, and whether it's, Turing test possible and all those kind of things. So,
yeah.
inevitably it just goes into the deeper, discussion. But yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, it is. I liked it. It's not my type of music, but I
Yeah.
listened to it like 2 or 3 times, and
Uh,
it's good for a laugh. Let's put it that way.
right.
Um, so for the model themselves, this is a tricky one because when you think about it, um, the models are not specifically software in the traditional sense. You cannot. So if you use a software license, the software license, it talks about code, it talks about source code. There is no such thing for a model. It's for the actual model itself. It's usually just a file with a bunch of weights, or I'm probably butchering the technical explanation, but I understand it enough to do harm to myself and others about the technology. But um, it's sort of controversial in that sense that it um, I think that there is a very good argument to be made on whether or not the existing software licenses should be used for the models themselves. So there is a growing number, or a few licenses that are created specifically for models. For example, there is the Rail. I'm going to explain because I always forget uh, what the acronym is. And then the data sets themselves, as I mentioned, they're mostly, if we're talking about open source or open access in this sense, we're talking about things that usually are released under Creative Commons licenses. So we're talking about usually Creative Commons attribution 4.0. It's still very popular. Attribution on commercial, etc., etc. So the data sets themselves would be released not under software licenses, because obviously a data set is not software. It should be released using um, Creative Commons, I think, or any other equivalent. But I think Creative Commons is the standard. There are a few other licenses. Open Data Commons, I think, is one. Um, and there are some potential projects that are going to be developing this. So Rail is uh, responsible AI pubs licenses, and they have 4 licenses: M for models, S for software, standard, and for research. And the grant of licenses that you are allowed to perform any restricted acts as long as these conditions are met. The user-based restrictions must be kept, and the third parties must receive a copy of the license. So that's pretty standard uh, open license. Derivatives must contain visible notices and retain all notices pertaining to other IP rights. So the interesting thing that I've always been thinking about, and I'm not entirely sure, what would be a derivative of a model, for example? What would that consist of? Um, is any output a derivative? In which case, that opens an entire can of worms that I'm not even going to touch. So um, that is sort of one of the licenses. There are other that are being thought and under development potentially. So what's interesting, and I think what I want to, more than going into sort of the detail on this, on the licenses themselves, because I still think that it's early days. We're starting to see the ecosystem developing. We're starting to see um, uh, the company sort of jockeying for position in this growing and very new market. Um, but it's interesting that I've been noticing some narratives that are starting to happen, and these narratives are very similar in some ways to what we saw with with the old open source debates on versus proprietary software. And by the way, this is my favorite test prompt. Whenever I'm testing a new model, I use a cat in Istanbul because Istanbul is full of cats. So
That's true.
yeah,
Have you
it's a
seen that
lovely city.
movie? Have you seen that movie, Cats in Istanbul? That's a documentary. Sorry, I'm
Oh,
digressing. Yeah, you probably
yeah,
have.
I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it. I
Yeah,
really should see it. But
yeah.
yeah, it so what I've been
Mhm.
interested is sort of these narratives are rising, which is, for example, open source AI is dangerous, as it can be subject to controls. So this is sort of linked to AI doomerism, the idea that we should control AI because AGI is going to come and kill us all or take over the world or something like that. So the idea is that if we have models that are out in the wild and are available for everyone to use, that means that people are going to get their hands on uh, weapons or models that can help them do nefarious things. That is sort of the idea. And this is actually sometimes even pushed by corporate closed companies. I've heard some narratives being pushed. Oh, you shouldn't be doing any open source. Open source is bad because it will lead to bioweapons, to dirty bombs and all sorts of nasty stuff. So the idea is that. It, um, then there is another narrative that I've seen that open source AI is under threat from regulation. So regulators hate open source. So this is usually from the open source proponents, and they're going to say they hate us. They are coming for us, and they're going to destroy us. So um, and then there's a third narrative, which is that open source AI doesn't actually exist, and we have never. It's a very interesting narrative that says whatever you've seen that says it's open source AI is actually not open source AI because it doesn't meet any of the requirements for open source software. It doesn't meet the transparency. The models are not open, actually, etc., etc. So sort of the doomerist one, there's quite a lot of videos. There's even a, a YouTube video. Um, it was a discussion around the Llama 2. So, is open source AI dangerous? Like, is this a bad thing? Um, so there are lots of articles and sort of Twitter threads again, and even it has made it a little bit to mainstream discussion. So this is sort of the first narrative. The second one is an article that came about just over a year ago, and I I cannot find it anymore, and I'm not sure. I can only find archived versions, but I don't know if the website was taken down. The idea is that the EUAA Act was going to target US open source software and it was going to destroy open source software. So that was sort of the idea was any type of regulation is being presented or specifically brought to destroy open source. And I think it has died down. I remember seeing about a year ago, lots of people were panicking, particularly open source developers were saying, oh, the EU is coming after us. Sort of reminded me of the US coming after our memes discussion that we had some years ago before the Digital Single Market Directive. That's another story. And then the idea that there is no such thing as open source AI. This is a good article, Open for Business, Big Tech, Concentrated Power and the Political Economy of AI, with some people that I really admire, like Meredith Whittaker uh, of Signal and some other people. And I think that the argument is quite interesting that whatever we've seen as open AI or open source AI is not really open. And I won't explain it. I'll leave that for people to read it. But it's fascinating. So I think that what's happening to start looking at a little bit the future, we have a bit of legal uncertainty potentially. We're going to have a regulation now. I'll explain a little bit. There are lots of lawsuits taking place. So there is one that has an open source element to it, but it's against GitHub. But for the most part, it's all of these are being fought against closed and proprietary developers. Well, the exception of Meta, that depends on whether or not we consider Meta to be open source or not. That is another question we'll discuss later. What's interesting, what has been happening is that we have the AA Act that has just been passed by the Parliament, and the corrigendum has been just released like last week. So we're going to get the publication probably very soon, June, July. The final version. After that is the implementation. So they have a definition of sort of a generative AI as a set of foundation model. They're not using foundation anymore. It's GPAIs. General purpose
AI.
general purpose AI. So I think foundation models are a bit passé now. It depends. Some people still use foundation
Yeah,
models.
it's not cool anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit. I think because now people are moving to GPAIs, it's sort of getting more.
It's
more
so
used.
interesting because I was just in a book club with the California Law Association. We were discussing The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman, which I suggested, and there was interesting talk about how actually to the opposite, to the contrary, some businesses would be very interested in foundation models and like their business domain specific stuff, and also having their solutions on prem as opposed to those cloud services, because people are concerned with privacy and cybersecurity and IP concerns, where you don't want to cut and paste your proprietary code into ChatGPT and it ends up who knows where. So this is very interesting to me. So we'll see how that plays out. There's definitely we're not even close to consensus, I think. So, and I think that's also how it's going to be perceived in the EU and the US, and when the AI Act will actually be in kind of a full, throttle. So we'll see how that is going to play out. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think that what's happening is they're talking about the same thing. It's just that the language, it used to be foundation models in the AI Act in the earlier drafts, and now they changed it almost entirely. I can't remember. I need to do a text check, but I don't think that they mention foundation models at all anymore. And I think it is a political decision because the origin of the word is from Stanford. So I think that they didn't want something that was very Americanized. But that's my perception. I am completely speculating.
You mentioned Stanford, and I just want to say that Stanford kind of has been insisting on using the word open weights models.
Yes, that's
open source.
Open weight. I like
yes.
open weight model better.
It makes things not as just kind of don't know where you stand. What do you mean by this? So they kind of trying to be as precise as possible. It's just definitions have been changing. Everything is.
Yeah, I really like that open weights actually. Yeah, I think I had heard it before, but yeah, it's a good one. So sort of what we have now is with the AI Act for the purposes of open source or open AI. You cannot say open AI anymore either as well because it's a company. So yeah, that's why open weights is quite nice. So in the act, it's open source models are going to be exempt from some requirements. So the idea is precisely because this was a very big political fight. That because some European companies are going very open source or open weights, precisely to compete against the closed proprietary giants from the United States. It was considered that any regulation would be potentially being in perceived as being affecting European development and uh, favoring potentially US developers. So the idea was to come up with this. So Recital 102 says software and data, including models, released under a free and open source license that allows them to be openly shared and where users can freely access, use, modify, and distribute them or modified versions thereof, can contribute to research and innovation. So they're telling us that open source is good. And the license should be considered to be free and open source as when it allows users to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve software and data, including models under the condition that the original provider of the model is credited, the identical and comparable terms of distribution are respected. So this is their definition of open source in the Act. It doesn't tell us which type of license specifically, so it doesn't give us a list of licenses. It doesn't tell us it will have to be one of the OSI defined licenses. I think they're doing this precisely to keep open the fact of new model licenses arising in the future that we haven't considered, but they're telling us the characteristics that they should have. So pretty much standard for open source. But it's quite specific. And then free and open source AI components covers the software. So this is very important as well. They're telling us what it covers. It covers the software itself, the data, and including the models and general purpose AI models, tools, services, or processes of an AI system. So it covers pretty much everything. It's not just the license for the software itself, but all of these other tools as well. And the transparency requirement. So I should explain this quickly because we will run out of time. There's going to be a transparency requirement, particularly for copyright issues, in which if you have a model that is that falls under GPAI, general purpose AI, and you're using works that are covered by copyright, you have to provide a list of those works that are
what went into the training?
That went into the
how's
training.
How's that even
Nobody
feasible?
knows how
How
that is.
it's even feasible from, like, I don't even know, from
Yeah.
engineering perspective. Do you keep track, like, of your like billions of tokens?
Yeah.
I mean, what's going
We
on
don't
there?
know.
Maybe that's a silly question, but I'm just kind of a user of this.
It's not a silly question at all.
How
Everyone
are
is
you going to
wondering.
catalog that? Is
Yeah.
it going to be automated somehow? I
We
guess
don't know.
you have to build solutions, in-house that would enable you to actually keep track of all of that.
Yeah. So the language sort of was changed a little bit. So the latest version is talking about a summary. So you don't need to provide a list of absolutely everything that you're using, but you have to provide a complete summary. The language is sort of a bit nitpicky, but pretty much it says it gives a new authority, a new regulator. The regulator is going to say to the providers what goes into those transparency reports.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so the transparency requirement, this is very important. It is not covered by the open source exceptions. So even if you have an open source model, you're going to have to comply with transparency requirements. So this regulator is going to be called the AI office, and is going to provide templates on what is covered in the transparency reports. So
it is so interesting. It is interesting because, like, when you're talking about open source software, I mean, software is, at least in the US, it's mostly, I mean, it's protected by copyright.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're training your models on copyrighted open source software, then you will be subject to this requirement.
Yes, if it's sold in Europe. No,
Yeah.
or if it has, that's the other thing. It's going to have a very strong international reach. So every service that is sold or it is used by European citizens is going to be covered by the directive.
Yeah, we have
And
a really
everyone is up in arms about that.
yeah, we have a
I'm
funny
getting
comment here.
Yeah.
Proprietary system to track the use of open source software, which is ironic, sort of like oxymoron, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But we don't really know how that's gonna play out. We'll see.
Yeah,
Just kind of listing the requirements for now.
yeah,
See what happens.
yeah. It is.
regulation with a twist.
It's so yeah. The other thing is again going sort of the debate that is happening. Well, some people were very uh, were very um, um, were not nice to this to the AI Act. This is one example of this. People were very critical of it. So, just to conclude, to allow for some questions or just some more discussion, uh, we have no idea what this is going to cover. I think that it's really good that open source is covered by the AI Act. I found it absolutely fascinating that it's eventually going to allow development to happen without too much encumberment in some requirements. But the fact that we have this very onerous, potentially transparency requirement and a very difficult international application, that means that everyone is going to have to come to grips with this. If you were thinking of having a service in Europe at all,
Think again.
what I'm afraid that could happen is precisely that we may start seeing services that say if you're in Europe you cannot use our service. I don't know if that is ever going to happen, but yeah, it's just fascinating to think about all of this. So with that
And
sort of cheery thought, thanks very much, and let's. I don't know if there are questions or things that we can
Yeah,
we
discuss.
always have questions.
yeah, we have
Yeah, of course.
there's
Yeah,
some we
that's
have
that's
a
the other
very
thing I really like about the
we have a
about the
very
show.
active listener goes
Mhm.
by name Minova, and
Mhm.
with respect to definitions of open source, I mean, I just literally looked it up. Thank you for
Mhm.
again for keeping me on my toes. But yeah, they have just updated their definition of open source software. So they
Yeah,
do have, and
yeah.
I tried to post a link into the chat, but it's actually on their website, and I can pop it up if you guys want,
Mhm.
just to kind of give folks the pointer. Just a sec,
Yeah,
where that is.
yeah. There is the standard definition of the OSI with all of the requirements.
Yeah,
One of them is precisely that you cannot discriminate against fields of endeavor, and one of the criticisms that Llama 3 is getting precisely that is
right.
not really open source is that it doesn't meet that
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that
So, I
requirement.
mean, yeah, I think that we're touching on like two things in terms of definitions. And
Yeah,
yeah, they've just updated their open source definition per se, which is like all this, requirements,
yeah,
derivative works, no discrimination, things like that, distribution of the license,
yeah,
all those things.
yeah,
And that's one thing, right? And another thing that's going on is that you mentioned, Andres, is the definition of open source AI.
yeah.
And this is something that we still don't have. However, OSI is working on this one as well,
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
together with Linux Foundation Generative Commons. And this is something that I also wanted to kind of show you guys is that
Yes, I
there's a
left it out precisely because of that. I
yeah.
wanted you to tell us about it.
No, that's okay. I just came back from the Linux summit, open source summit in Seattle, and I've been to talks by Linux Foundation Generative Commons group that they have just launched last year to discuss precisely these issues.
Mhm.
And I think they're very well positioned. And I think anyone can, there's it's pretty open group. I mean, you can join, discuss things.
Mhm.
But what they have also just presented, and I think this is very helpful, and it speaks directly to the licensing framework, kind of a licensing matrix for
Mhm.
all this AI system components. So they have what they call the model openness framework,
Mhm.
where they basically suggest the criteria on how you would categorize and how you would actually make a decision on whether the model is even open or not. And
Mhm.
here they actually have, and let me see if I can enlarge it a little bit, maybe not, but basically the gist is that they do offer a matrix with different licenses. So they categorize the components. Let's say if it's a data set, what's the content type is data.
Mhm.
So their suggestion that we could possibly license that under some Creative Commons license, which is historically has been used for texts, images, sort of like when you
Mhm.
open source your image. How you do that? GPL probably not a good license, or MIT. So, and then they just go through this model components. It's like training code, inference
Mhm.
code. I find it pretty helpful. It kind of gives you the idea. You could start thinking about how we could even structure this. So this is something that I found really helpful. Just kind of giving a shout out to Linux Foundation, and we will post the links after the talk to
Mhm.
resources, because I think that's pretty helpful to me as the person who have dealt with open source license issues for the past, I don't know, 14 years. So this is definitely not kind of a trivial scenario, because we just also used to thinking that open source licenses, I mean, they are
Mhm.
applicable to software, but what happens when the content, your material is not software? What
Yeah.
happens, right? And that's precisely what we have for AI systems, because it's so much more than that.
Yeah, yeah. In another life, I used to do quite a lot of work with Creative Commons. So I worked quite a lot on the 4.0 versions of the licenses, and one of the biggest discussions that we had, and um, back in the day, was precisely to draft a license that could be used for that databases,
Mhm.
because there was a very strong uh, philosophical aversion against the sui generis database, right?
Yes, sui generis. That's
Yeah,
a regime that we don't have in the United
yeah,
States. It's a purely
Yeah.
European construct, which I first heard about in the late '90s, I think, when
yeah.
I was doing research back in law school on the protections for copyright, databases and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So this is a very interesting legal concept.
Yeah, it is for people who are not familiar with it. It's a right that exists only in Europe, and in the UK we have it as a legacy that protects databases, and it's a strange right. It's obviously a sui generis right, so it's not copyright. Is that and what it's protecting is the investment that goes into the
Yes.
creation of the database, and you infringe it by extracting data. So either by extracting a substantial amount of the database, of the contents of the database, or uh, um, lots of tiny little bit subsequent.
And it's so interesting to me why
Yeah.
this concept didn't really take off in the United States, because I feel like one of the differences between the common law and civil law when it comes to copyright is that in common law here, and I guess in the UK, it's more of a kind of, the emphasis is more like economic, value, and that's why we have so many rights for like producers and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But in Europe, on the contrary, it's more of a kind of moral rights, droit d'auteur, right? Sort of
Yeah.
like the extension your copyright expression, it's extension of your personality, not necessarily something the rights would be granted to people who invest into that process. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So precisely, I think it was because mostly Feist. It's a little
Oh
bit
yeah,
at
that's a
some
notorious
point.
copyright case. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's like
yeah.
if you take IP
Uh,
in the U.S. law
Everybody
school,
knows
yeah.
the
you would
case.
read Feist.
So
Yeah.
databases were not considered to be
Mhm.
copyrightable, and
Yeah.
um, the interesting thing is that at some point, earlier Creative Commons licenses specifically said that they did not cover databases or the database right. And 4.0 was actually unique in saying lots of European stakeholders needed the protection as well. So it had to be included at some point. I remember. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is I am reminded a little bit of that eventually, if we are going to use Creative Commons for models, maybe Creative Commons it's a better fit than software licenses because it's drafted in a way that is very content agnostic,
Hmm.
if I may use that term. So it can be used. It's not recommended, but it could even be used for software. I don't recommend anyone to use Creative Commons for software, but yeah, I've seen some people use Creative Commons for
Yeah,
software.
and
It's crazy.
I've always wondered why, because there's just variety of licenses
Yeah,
that you could
yeah,
license your software under, and why would you go with, Creative Commons licenses? I wasn't.
yeah.
I mean, but
I
again,
have no
it's
idea.
wishes of the author. I mean, you can do whatever you want. You can license the same piece of code under different licenses.
Yeah, exactly.
To you, it could be a GPL, and to somebody else, that would be a proprietary piece. So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I think that potentially it's interesting that we could have a Creative Commons. I don't know if Creative Commons is going to. I've been out of the loop for a while, but if Creative Commons is ever going to consider maybe drafting their own Creative Commons model version, or
They should, right?
yeah, they should exactly. But what we have now it's potentially licenses that are specifically for models. So that I find quite interesting, um, and potentially, yeah, I, I think it could be uh, good thing in the future. It's going to be quite complex, and it's going to be great for researchers and for lawyers, and as the Chinese saying goes, "May you live in interesting times," and it's actually a curse, I guess. Mm.
Exactly, which we are. We should, enjoy every moment when you
Mhm.
just get your brain is about to explode with fresh piece of information.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, we
that's.
have a question. The right to be
Um,
forgotten. Oh my God, that's a,
Oh, wow.
wow.
That's a GDPR domain.
Yeah, yeah. Right to
General
erasure.
Data Protection Regulation. I'm just spelling
yeah,
out. Sometimes I feel like we're throwing these acronyms
Yeah,
everywhere, and maybe some audiences are not necessarily aware. So I'm just trying to spell them a little bit,
yeah,
spell them out a little bit.
yeah.
So yeah,
My goodness.
General Data Protection Regulation
Yeah,
in Europe.
yeah. Right to be forgotten. Now it's generally called um, um, right to erasure. I'm not even going to go there. Um, I used to do data protection ages ago, but I am not. That's way beyond my pay grade, as they say.
yeah. There's, I think there's like a clarification. Not possible to just delete my data
Yeah,
from generative
Yeah,
AI.
I think that
Obviously, yeah. It's
yeah.
once
whatever
it's
happens at this,
there.
whatever happened, yeah, at
Yeah,
this
We don't
point,
know.
retroactively, we cannot go back and
Yeah,
just open these data sets that were already kind of sucked into the, the
yeah.
training and the release models. I think whatever happens now and how the emerging regulatory framework is going to affect what's going to be developed from now on, that yes, but I don't think that retroactively that can be done. I don't know, Andres, what's your take on
Yeah,
it?
no. There is talks that there may be some technical ways of models forgetting things, but
Uh-huh.
yeah. I heard
it's
something.
I've read a couple of papers, but it's limited. Yeah, that's not something that I manage. It's not so much forgetting in the model itself, but it's sort of like giving it a bit of a lobotomy, if we want to call it like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Uh, that that can forget that it knows something very selectively, but the output level. So you tell it sort of it's like a filter, but again, that is something that I haven't really thought about because it's a subject that, even though it's very very interesting, it's I haven't explored that. It has been subject of regulatory scrutiny in Italy. I
In
think that
Italy?
the Italian data protection authority,
Yeah, they are
yeah,
very strict. I
yeah,
mean, they're like they work hard. You know,
yeah,
when there's some final happening, it's oftentimes Italian data protection authorities. Yeah.
yeah. So there was, I think that for a few days uh, they for they were forbidding the use of ChatGPT
Hmm.
in Italy, precisely because of that. That you cannot remove personal data from models. I have to admit, it's something that I haven't looked at. It's something that that other people have been looking. Um, I can tell you, Spain. Yeah, thanks. I haven't been following the debate. Potentially, um, uh, someone that I would recommend that you invite as well, Lillian Edwards, my friend. Um, um, she's the data protection lawyer in our group of friends. She's whenever she has a copyright question, she asks me. Whenever I have a data protection question, I ask her.
Oh, Andres, have you seen? I just recently downloaded a book, on my Kindle to read, and for the first time ever, I saw author's kind of a note saying that I do not give permission, uh, to train AI
Yeah,
models or my copyright material to go into AI data training sets. So this is
yeah,
the first time I've seen it, and it's a relatively new book. So
yeah,
I was wondering, I was like, you cannot retroactively do stuff. I mean, even right now we're on YouTube, so I think we gave out our likenesses and our images or video
yeah,
to potentially to the data training sets, but that might be like a new paradigm
yeah,
emerging, but I don't know how enforceable it is, how
yeah.
again, back to watermarking and all those kind of things. But
Um, the the European opt-out requirements or reservation of rights, to give it
Mhm.
its proper legal term, um, the argument is that it has to be machine readable. So
Ah,
it's not specifically mentioned that it has to be machine readable, but there's an idea that it has to be machine readable. However, there is a big problem with that, with works that are not uh,
literary works,
yeah,
yeah,
like literary works or works that are
textual
not designed to be online. So
and
how do
zeros and
you
ones.
do the reservation of rights if it's a work that is by
Mm,
definition not online? Do you put it in a database? Who is going to pay for that database?
yeah.
um, so yeah, but I think that we are moving towards that, to allow people to opt out. There are people who want an opt-in system. Don't, I'm skeptical of opt-in systems. Just in general, I think philosophically or ethically, I can see the argument, but
Mhm. Practically
practically, they're
speaking,
very
you don't think
practically it's
folks
very
going to be
difficult.
inclined to go through all this, opt-in
Yeah,
checkboxes or toggle,
yeah. It's I just think it's problematic from a practical perspective. So I believe that potentially we're going to end up with opt-out systems, and it's already in the European legislation. It's a part of the Digital Single Market Directive,
Mhm.
and um, the argument is going to be how can you opt out? So is putting it in the cover of your book enough?
Yes.
Yeah, I think eventually we'll probably have to come up with standards. With some form of international database where you can put all of your opt-outs, not only with technical standards but also standards of how it's done, so so that people
Um,
that are training an AI can look up and just make sure that that work is not trained. But then if it's in a database, how does that work whenever you encounter it in the wild? It's just very difficult. Yeah.
I was just gonna quickly say that I've been helping out a client, and she's currently working on writing a book. And the publisher, they're based in the UK, and they reached out to her recently, and they are trying to kind of get the sentiment from the authors on their use of generative AI. And it's kind of like, so we already using, actually, by the way, they're using agents, they're using all sorts of stuff. So their own co-pilot for their corpus. What's in that corpus? No one knows. And yet they're kindly emailing people for their feedback. So how would you look at us already using that stuff? We're just kind of letting you know it's already happening. Yeah, but it's interesting. And they're talking about licenses there as well. So guys, you will be reimbursed if something happens. And and that's it, like in general, talking about those like big models, right? Trained on millions and billions of tokens. It's kind of cute. After you've trained on the internet, you're giving the people the right to opt out. Okay, we don't need you. We don't need your content. We got everything.
Yeah,
that's okay. You can opt out now.
Yeah, that's a problem. The idea is that the models are going to be, I think potentially that the models are going to be outdated, or the technology is going to improve, particularly the way in which the models are trained is going to make any of the existing models that were trained without opt-outs obsolete, just because they're not very good. We're already sort of seeing that with some of the image models. Like you can use Midjourney
like
version 3, or you can use Stable Diffusion 1.5, but why would you?
Yeah. So it won't pass your cat in Istanbul master.
Exactly. Yeah. I have very early versions of Cat in Istanbul with the old models, and
and considering we're all going to be out of human generated content pretty much soon, so synthetic content it's already kind of taken out. We have like mere years, guys, left. We have just probably a year left, and just
and
it's going to be in such short supply.
Yeah,
that's astonishing to me. It took like a year and a half, like 18 months or something like that. For the entire internet to be scraped, and models to be trained on the data. This is fascinating and scary a little bit. So where do we go from there? It's a more kind of philosophical, I guess, like
Andres, where do we go
especially
from
since we're out of time.
What do we do?
I don't know. We're just going to be in the cloud at some point. Come the singularity, or
I like that.
Yeah, I don't believe in the singularity, by the way. Just a joke.
Oh, you know.
If you mention the singularity,
the cloud.
Yeah. If you mention the singularity, you're immediately, people think that you are an AGI religious nut or something.
Oh, really?
You're in the sect.
I don't know. Yeah, I feel like singularity is not like a point in time. It's more of a kind of a process, maybe. But yeah, we don't go there. It's
Yet.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, then.
I just wanted, as a kind of our last thing, and Elena's mentioned. Yeah, I'm trying to share something. Do you see it?
Oh yes.
My favorite person. So so many things that are coming at you these days, from all the different perspective, and we touched on the legal kind of a aspect, and also on the more about kind of society, more like sociological aspect of open versus closed models. And I don't know what people who are not in the industry specifically, or who are not legal professionals, engineers, what do they think about that? But I think it's actually a very relevant thing to think about for the future as well. How open or closed those systems should be. because they will affect all the facets of our lives. And yeah, so trying to not dodge bullets, but stop
They
them.
already are.
So
Yeah.
yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
At
I-
some point,
I-
yeah.
Yeah, I still love the Matrix as well. Too
The
bad they
first
didn't.
one.
The
Okay.
first one, of
So
course.
yeah, I
Should be the
think
first
we're
Yeah.
out of time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Andres,
Oh, we are out of time long time ago, but who
go
cares?
ahead.
Yeah. But thanks very much
Thank you
again
so
for
much.
the invitation.
No,
Yeah.
thank you, Andres.
Yeah,
It
so,
was fascinating
Mhm.
Thank you
to
so
hear.
much.
I learned a
Andres.
lot today.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's really, I mean, this topic is really gaining traction. And as you mentioned, there's this kind of divide in the community between what should be open, what should be closed, what's open source, what's source available. I mean, what's proprietary, what's not, like commercial, because there are all these different things. And all of a sudden, it used to be such a niche kind of a discussion, but all of a sudden, I think it's just kind of goes beyond just software community, like open source community, academia, some businesses who are leveraging open source. It just goes beyond that, I think, towards, just people who are not necessarily technical people, because of how important it is and how it's going to affect everybody's life. So yeah, with that, I mean, our next talk is going to be in a couple of weeks, and please tune in.
We'll make an
and
announcement.
Thank you so much. Any questions, please let us
Thank you.
know. And we'll try to address them maybe post talk.
I'll be
Thank you
I'll
so
be
much.
listening. But yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again
Bye,
for the
everyone.
invitation.
Bye.
Thank you.